My wealthy in-laws stole over $200,000 from our kids' trust fund, so I took them for $3 million. Me, 38F, and my husband Jack, 40M, have been married for 12 years. We have 2 kids, Emma, 10F, and Tim, 8M. Jack comes from a wealthy family that made their fortune in real estate development. His parents, Richard, 65M, and Karen, 62F, have always looked down on me because I came from a middle-class background. Despite being incredibly successful themselves, they acted like I was some kind of gold digger trying to get at their precious son's inheritance. Little did they know, I was more financially stable than Jack before we even got married, thanks to my own business ventures. Whenever we visited them, the snide comments and backhanded insults never stopped. Must be nice to have someone else pay the bills. I always wondered what Jack saw in you. It was exhausting. The final straw came at Emma's 10th birthday party last month. We went all out, rented a beautiful venue, hired entertainers, got an incredible cake. Richard and Karen showed up late, naturally. As soon as they walked in, Karen pursed her lips and said loudly to Richard, "Oof, I see the party planners went overboard again. Trying to overcompensate for something?" I pulled her aside and told her that if she couldn't be kind, she shouldn't have come at all. Karen looked at me like I had 3 heads. "How dare you speak to me that way? Do you know who I am?" She sneered. "This is my son's money paying for this gaudy affair." That's when Jack stepped in and told them to leave if they couldn't stop being rude. They stormed out, but not before Richard told Jack he was an embarrassment. A few days later, I discovered something that made my blood boil. I was going through old documents when I found the paperwork for the trust fund Jack's parents had set up for the kids when they were born. According to the documents, Richard and Karen had allocated $500,000 to each kid's fund. Generous, right? I thought so too, until I saw they had explicitly instructed that I was to have zero control or access to the money. Only they could decide when and how to spend it. In other words, those smug jerks had given themselves complete authority over our children's inheritance, all because of their dislike for me. I was absolutely livid. This was a huge violation of our trust as parents. But it got worse. I started digging deeper and discovered that over the years, they had already spent over $100,000 from each fund on things like expensive gifts, for themselves. Lavish vacations, home renovations, you name it. They were literally pillaging our children's trust funds to subsidize their own opulent lifestyle. Tens of thousands were gone, and the kids hadn't seen a dime of it. It was all a disgusting power play. I immediately confronted Jack about it, showing him the paperwork. He was just as horrified as I was, having been completely in the dark this whole time. "I can't believe they did this. Those are Emma and Tim's savings, not their personal piggy bank," he said angrily. We made copies of all the documents, preparing for the fight of our lives. Part of me wanted to rush over and scream at them right then. But I knew they would try to play dumb or make endless excuses. We needed to nail them to the wall over this in a way they couldn't deny or justify. So we spent weeks methodically going through year after year of bank statements, compiling an overwhelming amount of evidence. The more we found, the sicker it made me feel. This was our own children being robbed by their grandparents out of spite towards me. Finally, we had everything we needed. Hard proof that over $200,000 combined had already been plundered from the kids' trust funds by Richard and Karen over the years. We set up a meeting under the guise of discussing estate planning and made sure it was just the 4 of us. When we arrived at their mansion, I was shaking with rage. But I managed to keep my cool as we went over some fake financials first. Then, when Karen finally sneered, "Yes, and what are your plans for the children's funds?" I looked her dead in the eye as Jack and I slammed the massive evidence file on the desk. "Funny you should ask," I said coldly. "Because we have evidence that you've already been spending their inheritance like drunken sailors for years." The smug look dropped from Richard and Karen's faces instantly. We proceeded to calmly lay out all the bank statements, venue receipts, invoices, and more, proving their serial theft. They tried to make excuses at first, insisting it was harmless family loans and not meant maliciously. But we fired back with point after point, overwhelming them with the magnitude of their actions. "Harmless loans? You took over $200,000 that wasn't yours. That's theft from your own grandchildren," Jack yelled, shocking even me with his outrage towards his own parents. Karen actually started crying crocodile tears, accusing us of being ungrateful for everything they'd done for us and the children. I almost snapped. "You mean like buying a $70,000 yacht with Tim's college fund? Get real," I shouted back. We went around and around like this, them trying to gaslight and deny reality while we kept piling on the damning evidence. Richard's face got more red with each salvo until you could practically see the smoke coming out of his ears. Fine. We did take liberties with their trust funds for expenses. So what? It's our damn money anyway that we gifted them. He finally exploded. My eyes went wide. They admitted it. All on video too, which we had been discreetly recording on a laptop this whole time. No, it absolutely wasn't your money. I shot back. That inheritance was meant for our children and their futures. Not subsidizing your ridiculously lavish spending habits. Karen tried one last ploy. Maybe this wasn't handled properly, but it's because of you we felt the need to do this. You've turned our son against his own family with your poisonous influence. That's when Jack stepped up, having heard more than enough. Don't you dare try to blame my wife. You two have been nothing but arrogant, condescending bullies to her since day one out of pure snobbery. He pointed an accusing finger at them both. This was about getting petty revenge on Stephanie by robbing your grandchildren's savings. That's just unforgivable. Things devolved into a screaming mess after that. Richard and Karen's mask of superiority had finally slipped, revealing to hideously selfish and toxic people beneath. At one point, Karen even started tearing up the evidence, prompting me to snatch away the rest while yelling, "You're only digging yourself deeper." By the end, they were literally sputtering like riled-up toddlers when Jack gave them the ultimate ultimatum. Either you both resign as trustees over Emma and Tim's funds immediately and give us full control, or we're taking you to court and sucking you dry on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and more. Richard's face cycled through about 12 different shades of plum before he finally snarled, "Fine. Do whatever you want. We're still richer than you'll ever be." Looking back, I have no idea how Jack and I maintained our composure and didn't just start wailing on him. But we took the high road, said nothing, gathered up our belongings, and headed for the door. On the way home, Jack and I felt a sort of grim satisfaction. For the first time ever, we had taken a firm stand against his monstrous parents and their abusive behavior. They had been completely stripped of the ability to keep financially manipulating our children. But, we also recognized that they were still obscenely wealthy and undoubtedly bitter about the whole thing. This wasn't over by a long shot. Sure enough, over the following weeks, the retaliation began. First, they started bad-mouthing and lying about us to other relatives, claiming we had turned against the family over nothing and acting like the victims. I had to put out fires with disgusted aunts, uncles, and cousins who were being fed misinformation. Then the lawyers arrived, sending us letters filled with thumping legal jargon. They made it clear that if we didn't back down on the control over the funds, they would drag us through endless court battles. Our own lawyer assured us we would prevail, but the process would be long and agonizing. But it didn't stop there. Next, Richard and Karen played perhaps their cruelest card, using their wealth to turn Emma and Tim against us too. Out of nowhere, the kids started getting lavished with incredibly expensive gifts, brand new laptops, VR gaming consoles, even talk of getting them mini cars when they were older. Anything to try making those jerks seem like the cool grandparents. I sat them down and explained in firm but kid-friendly terms what had happened with the trust funds. How the grandparents had basically been stealing their money. Emma seemed to understand, but Tim just saw the fancy toys and didn't care where they came from. That's when Karen sent Emma a handwritten letter, spinning these wild tales about Jack and I being unsafe and trying to take her inheritance away because we were jealous. My blood boiled reading the manipulative garbage. They had escalated to emotional warfare, trying to turn our own flesh and blood kids against us through material bribery and outright lies. I had never felt such seething hatred towards two people. From there, it only got uglier. More nasty letters from their lawyers, threats of pulling funding in other areas, you name it. Anything to try bullying us into submission. The lowest blow came when Richard went behind our backs and tried getting temporary court orders to enforce grandparents' rights and visitation with Emma and Tim against our will. As if they had any right to see those kids after their treachery. We fought those tooth and nail and succeeded in quashing the orders, but not without a lot of added stress and legal costs. I'm talking incessant phone calls from their attorneys, missed days off work for hearings, character assassination attempts, the whole 9 yards. My anger burned hotter with each new attack from them. At this point, they had declared total war, so I started meticulously documenting every despicable thing they did as fuel for the massive forthcoming lawsuit. When I mentioned that to Jack's Aunt Janice, who was sympathetic to our side, she urged caution. "Be careful if you go scorched earth on them, they'll try to bury you too," she warned. Little did I know how prophetic that would prove to be. With all other options exhausted, we finally did launch a massive legal salvo against Richard and Karen. Our lawyers cited fraud, embezzlement, emotional distress, alienation of affection, and a laundry list of other charges. The sheer amount of evidence we had made it essentially impossible for them to wriggle out of it. Their own lawyers must have seen the writing on the wall, because they advised total capitulation rather than going to court and risking everything. In the end, Richard and Karen were forced to 1. Resign as trustees over Emma and Tim's trust funds, with complete control being handed to us. 2. Repay every single penny they had plundered from the funds over the years, over $235,000 combined. 3. Paying our legal fees and costs in excess of $100,000. And perhaps most importantly, 4. Be placed under a permanent restraining order preventing any contact with our children until they become legal adults. That last one was the most cathartic. Knowing they no longer had any control or ability to manipulate Emma and Tim gave me a sense of relief. The financial bleeding didn't stop there either. You know that old saying about sting like a mule and kick all the way through? That was my mentality throughout this whole sordid affair. While our original lawsuit covered the theft of the kids' funds, my anger towards them was so white-hot that I insisted we go after their personal assets as well through additional civil claims. Alienation of affection, emotional distress and trauma, defamation, the whole 9 yards. In the end, the total judgments against Richard and Karen tallied over $3 million in damages, penalties, and legal fees that we won. It took years of grinding proceedings, but we were ultimately able to secure a judgment and begin seizing assets to collect their stock portfolio, properties, vehicles, art, jewelry, you name it. They fought like cornered rats, of course, trying to shield and shift their wealth. But the courts sided with us repeatedly thanks to our airtight documentation of their egregious actions over the years. It was soul-satisfying to see the gavel come down. While the extended legal battle drained us emotionally at times, Jack and I tried to insulate Emma and Tim from as much of it as possible. We put on a strong, united front as parents. Still, the trauma of having your own grandparents turn against you through manipulation and lies isn't something kids just immediately get over. Sweet little Emma would wake up crying some nights after having nightmares about her former idol grandparents doing more terrible things. Tim lashed out angrily too at times, clearly hurting from the betrayal despite trying to act tough. He was only 8 years old and having to grapple with billion-dollar narcissists using him as a pawn in their feud. There was one particularly rough patch when Tim started regressing by wetting the bed and having angry outbursts at school. A child psychologist diagnosed him with acute stress symptoms from the whole ordeal. I think it was hardest on Jack in some ways too. Having to accept that his parents were indeed the vindictive, cunning monsters we had claimed, it crushed him inside even if he never fully showed it. In the end, you could say we achieved a very complete and thorough form of justice against Richard and Karen. They suffered immense financial ruin, had all access cut off to our lives, and will go down as arguably two of the worst grandparents in modern history. Was it worth it, after all the emotional turmoil and endless legal battling? I still think absolutely yes, simply because of the moral principle involved. Those smug vipers conspired to rob their own grandchildren blind out of sheer malice towards me, and we made them pay $1 billion price as a result. It sends a clear message that such deplorable behavior towards family will not be tolerated whatsoever. Jack and I now sleep soundly knowing our kids' entire inheritances are under our full control forevermore, safe from those financial predators. Most importantly, our family is closer and stronger than ever before after being forged in the crucible of dealing with such toxicity. Emma and Tim are happy, healthy kids and their trust funds are growing rapidly thanks to the settlements. While I'll never be able to rid myself of lingering anger towards Richard and Karen's unforgivable acts, at least I take solace knowing they are still suffering the crushing consequences even now. I really went full nuclear scorched earth on those narcissistic jerks, and have zero regrets.